Thank you, Mr President. I seek leave to make a brief explanation before asking a question to the Minister for Aboriginal Affairs concerning comments he made in this chamber last week.
Is leave granted? Leave is granted. The Honourable Mrs Henderson.
On the Wednesday, the 13th of September 2023, the Minister told the chamber that the process to restart treaty negotiations will commence after the elections for the South Australian First Nations Voice have occurred. Professor Megan Davis, one of the Uluru Statement architects, has stated, and I quote, that treaties are about reparations for past injustice and that they are about land and they are about resources. In March 2023, Taylor Reid, a prominent Yes campaigner, called for reparations and compensation to be paid to Indigenous Australians. My questions to the Minister are, 1. Do you agree with Professor Davis' statement that treaties are about reparations, land and resources? And 2, do you support the payment of reparations and compensation to Indigenous Australians?
Well, the Attorney-General.
I thank the honourable member for a question. I can remember answering very similar questions 4 or 5 years ago when the Honourable Rob Lucas was on the other side of the chamber, might have even been in the same position that the honourable member sits in. Almost identical questions back then when we started treaty negotiations back in, I think, 2016, sir. And I will give a very similar answer to what I gave then. We are one of the only jurisdictions of those that we compare ourselves to that didn't even attempt any sort of agreement with Indigenous people when the land was colonised. We are some 230 years overdue to look at agreements with the First Nations people of Australia. I'm not going to stand up here and rule out and in how those negotiations might play out and how those negotiations might occur, as I didn't do that way back 5 or 6 years ago when the Honourable Rob Lucas invited me to do so. As I have said previously, we will wait for the voice body in South Australia to be elected to give us some advice on processes going forward, and then that is what we'll continue to do. One thing I do know from I think it was about a year and a half or so of treaty discussions that we had when Labor was previously in government, many different people have many different views over what these sorts of agreements may or may not contain. The discussions that developed and were quite well progressed were with 3 Aboriginal nations in South Australia, I think, as I've said before, Adyamatna, Narungga and Nurrunjeri, and many of the things that came up in those discussions were things to do with what the government would do in terms of provision of services in education, in particular in health and in the justice systems. We look forward, sir, as our commitment is, to the implementation of the Uluru Statement from the Heart, restarting those treaty discussions once the voice is elected. And unlike last time we started them in this state, sir, we are not alone in this endeavour in Australia. Victoria is well developed, have had their second elections for the First People's Assembly of Victoria, the elected treaty negotiating authority. Tony McEvoy SC has handed down the report of as the acting Northern Territory Treaty Commissioner on the way forward for the Northern Territory. Queensland has a treaty process underway. The new South Wales Labor government has committed to a treaty process. The former Liberal government in Western Australia, with the Southwest Native Title Agreement, the Noongar settlement, in all but name, entered into a treaty with the peoples from the southwest of that state. So this is not something we are alone in endeavouring to do, endeavouring to right historical wrongs, and I look forward to the day when we get started again.
Supplementary question, Mr President.
Supplementary, Mrs Henderson.
Thank you, Mr President. Will the Minister rule out the payment of reparations and compensation to Indigenous Australians?
As I said, I'm not going to do as I didn't when the Honourable Rob Lucas asked me questions about what will or won't form treaty discussion or negotiations. And I might just note, interestingly, one of the biggest proponents of moving forward a treaty agenda is Warren Mundine, one of the major lights in the No campaign. In fact, I think he was quoted in the last week saying a no vote makes treaties more likely. So for those who would oppose righting historical wrongs and injustices and entering agreements, even those who propose a no vote at the federal referendum are strong advocates and in fact say a no vote makes treaties more likely.